Welcome to the fourth webinar in our series, Anthropocene to the Ecozoic. My name is John Erickson, faculty member at the University of Vermont and participant in both of these partnerships that have sponsored this webinar, Economics for the Anthropocene and Leadership for the Ecozoic. We're really pleased to have three speakers with us today, all who are involved with the Leadership for the Ecozoic project. Meg Egler, a PhD student at the University of Vermont, Matt Burke, a postdoc at the University of Vermont, and Leah Temper, a research associate at McGill University. So we'll start with Meg. As I mentioned, Meg is a PhD student in the Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources, as well as a participant in the Leadership for the Ecozoic project. She's also very involved in Degrowth US, including a summer degrowth festival for Burlington that may happen. We're not quite sure how, but we're hopeful that some version of it will happen this summer. And she's going to talk to us today about agroecology and degrowth, complementarity and utopian futures. So Meg, take it away.
All right, perfect. I'm just going to start a little here so that I don't go too far over. Sorry, I should have done that. Okay, well, thanks for the introduction, John. This is exciting to present on this webinar series. The series is called From the Anthropocene to the Ecozoic. That's kind of what I want to talk about. The Anthropocene, human othering and domination over nature, which we all might be familiar with. Surrounding discourse encompasses extensive and diverse critiques of modernity, productivism, and capitalism. However, more recently, there's been a lot of calls to move beyond these critiques into more creative collective imaginings of what a viable future might look like beyond the Anthropocene. So in one of these such imaginings, Thomas Berry was the Ecozoic as an era between, between all beings, humans and otherwise, and called for the re-embedding of humans within ecosystems and extending the subjecthood to non-human beings and honoring the interdependence of human and non-human assemblages. So Thomas Berry identified a number of crucial areas for supporting this project, education being one of them, government as another. However, still remain regarding more specific pathways towards this future in light of our current and deep entrenched antithetical modern ideologies and institutions. So within this, there's also the acknowledgement that the sort of without limiting and imposing views, and that there is no towards the Ecozoic. Or how projects and movements that imagine these potential futures might co-evolve and collaborate in order to realize what, for the sake of this presentation, we're going to call the Ecozoic, but comes by many different names. So to begin with, I'm going to talk a little bit about an analytical framework we can use to identify complementarity between movements that are aimed towards the Ecozoic. And then I'm going to use agroecology and degrowth as an example of two movements that both support one another and may actually be necessary for one another to scale beyond small pockets in their practice. So, I also should mention this research and thought comes out of a lot of conversations with my colleague and comrade Katie Horner. So a lot of this we have her to thank for. The analytical framework proposed by Mooney and Hunt, this is a paper from 2009, explores the concept in flat keys within collective action frames. So in this framework, which conventions of a social movement, for example, have implications that boundaries of the movement itself. So we have flat keys, which are said to reinforce dominant interpretations and practices, ones that are benefiting from. Key is critical, suggestive of crisis, and presents a challenge to dominant institutions of conventions. So an example to explain this would be the collective action framing around food security in hunger and malnutrition. So the flat key framing used by organizations such as FAO, the World Bank, transnational agricultural corporations, we all might be familiar with statistical relations of hunger or food insecurity, and in favor to conversations around global food supply and solutions of trade liberalization, and a second green revolution, technological advancements that increase food security through the. So in opposition to this, we have sharp key frame, which food security becomes food sovereignty, and solutions become oriented towards justice, regional self-sufficiency, and context-specific low-tech solutions, with a deal of skepticism towards globalization and kind of the discourses of corporate. In this, the flat key framing does little to challenge the status quo and a lot in favor of reinforcing these already unbalanced power dynamics, whereas a sharp key framing is radical in direct opposition and is in opposition to the main hegemonic productivist narratives. So this framework has relevance for transformational utopian projects such as the Ecozoic, in that it provides a way to think of which movements have complementarity. The analytical framework posits that sharp key framings of different issues may have more in common than a sharp key and a flat key of the same issue. So, for example, movements that value plurality and oppose hegemony, whether they explicitly aim toward food sovereignty or a low carbon future, will have more potential to build bridges towards transformation than, say, a movement that wants to protect a river by the same river by legally acknowledging that it has rights in itself. So in considering this framework, we believe, Katie Horner and I, that in order to move from the Anthropocene to the Ecozoic, it will be necessary to pursue collaborative strategies across parallel sharp keys. So identifying these sharp keys within movements and projects and then trying to work within them. For this, as I said, at Agroecology, which in my institute, sharp keys that challenge hegemony and oppressive institutions that are antithetical to the Ecozoic. So we're probably all familiar with agroecology and degrowth. However, I'll give a short summary just so we're all on the same page. Agroecology focuses on the social and ecological sustainability of agri-food systems through the synthesis of indigenous, local, or peasant knowledges with science in Western sense. And it's a movement with strong radical grassroots historically growing out of the marginalized and oppression of producers in Latin America. So degrowth, differently, advocates for the voluntary, equitable, and scaling of societies, resource use, supported by a fundamental societal transformation. And this is in direct response to the growing recognition that the material economy and humankind cannot grow infinitely on a finite planet. And it's very much rooted within the global north, a lot of the discourse. So both agroecology and degrowth are in direct conflict to the mainstream productivist narratives around efficiency and technology, and both challenge the supremacy of kind of these neoliberal market logics and explicitly position themselves in support of plural pathways within their respective movements. So in this way, both are sharp keys. However, there is significant evidence documenting the success of agroecological production practices and their ability to improve food security. The field continues to be trivialized by an insufficient alternative approach to food production and consumption. So it's seen as alternative to the more mainstream agri-food systems. So while agroecologists have proposed a bundled approach to achieving more legitimacy through multiple and intertwined strategies across science, on-farm practices, and social movements, the success of this scaling for agroecology additionally requires there to be more diverse economic institutions that do not adhere to productivist narratives further beyond just the way we feed ourselves. So this is kind of where degrowth steps in. Degrowth literature coming out of ecological economics has a lot to say about re-envisioning economies, and as economies are responsible for the provisioning of food, this also means articulating utopian visions for agri-food systems. we probably know, currently much of the global agri-food system is governed by markets, with non-market social institutions increasingly subordinate. Sam Bliss also in this program has a lot to say about that. This contributes to positive feedback where mainstream discussions addressing these problems in agriculture build from a context already in. So several times removed from ecological complexity, these discussions, even though they're often well-intentioned, like such discussions around sustainable farming practices are often constrained by inability to imagine possibilities outside of an established market order. So the development and adoption of modern agriculture technology is more or less dependent on this baseline of acceptance that yield and efficiency gains are what we're aiming towards. And this kind of sidelines considerations for justice and equity and how agricultural technologies might actually perpetuate on a larger scale problems that they're meant to address. There's also a lot of great work being done there. So I guess what I'm trying to get at here is this is just one example of how non-capitalist forms of agri-food economies that exist currently or could exist are invisibilized by productivist logics, market logic, capitalism, whatever we want to call it, even though they offer an important parallel institution for meeting essential needs outside of the capitalist system. So we need to think more about how economies can be more diverse and how we can privilege other logics, perhaps before agroecology is able to expand and scale. So in that, we can see agroecology might benefit from degrowth, strengthening of diverse economies. But to me, the more interesting side is how do we need agriculture? So this work with Katie Horner, she is more positioned from an agroecology point of view and lens and had a lot to say from that side, whereas I'm more familiar with the degrowth literature. So any questions about degrowth? So the degrowth movement, a few things it's been criticized for is lacking perspective from and engagement with the global south. And though there's much lip service paid, there is little in the degrowth literature that outlines what an ethical and just degrowth transition might look like for those most exploited by capitalism. So it's currently, though there's been a lot of efforts to expand this, it's very much a discipline rooted in the global north. And I questioned this a lot until I went down to a conference in Mexico just this last, over Christmas, and a lot of the talk to down there that were outside of the negative perception of degrowth based on this. So I'm going to take their word for it. Also in the literature, actions proposed by degrowth have been surprisingly top-down and uniform. So though degrowth proponents advocate for a more bottom approach, there's been discourse analyses of the literature in degrowth that have shown that they're actually primarily top-down, uniform, and very dependent on the state. So these include things like taxation-based reforms, adjustments to trade agreements, unfortunately sometimes eco-labeling, and these kind of things threaten to exacerbate the existing inequalities even while the rhetorical position is towards plurality and context specificity. So there's a little bit of a disconnect there. So where ecology movement has remained non-prescriptive and pluralistic by practicing things like participatory approaches as core tenets, the policy recommendations coming out of degrowth literature have lagged and received a lot of criticism, both within academia and activism outside of the global north. Time check. Okay, so related to food systems, scholarship discussing agriculture and food systems in degrowth, it's sparse and primarily focused on how changes in consumption patterns and agricultural practices contribute to reductions in resources, resource use, and environmental sustainability. So these are things like certain pathways like sustainable intensification in agriculture, which highlights the use of efficient technologies to increase food supply from existing farmland while protecting biodiversity and ecosystems on other land. Regenerative agriculture, I'm not super familiar with it, but from what I could tell, outlines a lot of different and diverse farm practices that rebuild soil and create more resilient systems with the same yields as conventional agriculture. So we're still looking at yields. as compared to conventional agriculture. And then we have things like local organic production, home gardens, non-market food provisioning, and community-supported agriculture, which are all shortened food chains, increase self-sufficiency, and or strengthen community bonds within food systems. These practices align with certain goals of degrowth agenda, but they often singularly don't go far enough in addressing issues of justice and equity, or they do little to decenter humans within their objectives, or they contain elements that are no longer temporal scale, that are antithetical to degrowth, and fail to confront these productive narratives, all things that agroecology does. So agroecology, on the other hand, both as a scholarship, a movement, and a practice, makes a necessary contribution on the epistemological and ontological front that's needed for transformational change towards the Ecozoic. Okay, so I have a figure here. I would love it if people criticized it. I'm working on it. I haven't sent it out yet, but it's going to need some work. All I want to say here is that there might be a mutual necessity between agroecology and degrowth. Without either, we have the Anthropocene. With both, we might have the Ecozoic. Obviously, there's a lot of other things that need to go into this, but as a simplified version, the mutual necessity of degrowth and agroecology makes sense. Agroecology as an emancipatory project grew out of these marginalized and oppressed communities in Latin America, whereas degrowth pursues a project of just distribution in response to accumulation of wealth and power, mostly in the global north. So at the core, both projects address productivist narratives, neoliberalism, and injustice, and aim towards transformational change. However, they might require each other in order to scale up. A feeling of agroecology requires allies and the creation of economies and movements away from society's dependence on agro-industrial complexes. Then evolved degrowth requires this ontological shift towards an embeddedness and interdependence, and an epistemology that allows for place-specific, bottom-up, and pluralistic approaches. So a lot to learn from kind of the academic approaches or research approaches of agroecology. And in this, I would argue that the movements represent sharp keys with potential to enable and amplify one another, while also reinforcing anti-capitalist logics that challenge oppression and hegemonic institutions. So almost done here. I think this is where it gets interesting if we're applying this to policy, because in recognizing this, we can call for more scholar activist research and action to support and enable the creation of non-capitalist economic projects and ecological projects and overlapping ones and ones in between that communicate across both agroecological and degrowth. And then taking a step back, we can also call for more radical policy proposals and governance strategies that don't center market logics and productivism, but instead center logics of care and reciprocity and conviviality and sufficiency, which are all words that are used commonly in both of these. Posing what this means to me for policy is, if we want to transition towards the Ecozoic, we need to focus on policy initiatives that address sharp key framings of problems, whatever the discourse is around them. I think when we make a policy proposal, we have to ask ourselves, is this a sharp key framing, or is this a which I think is an important analytical framework for us to apply to all of our work, so that we aren't reinforcing the logics that we're trying to move away from. And at that, I'm ready for some questions.